In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, where secrets hide behind lace curtains, a butcher's van delivers more than meat. It carries a deadly mystery. When Tom Greaves is found murdered, a cleaver in his chest and a parcel of chops missing, Miss Jane Marple's sharp eyes see what others miss. A smudge of flour, a stranger's shadow, and a trail of blackmail. As whispers of smuggling and betrayal ripple through the village, can she unravel the truth before the killer strikes again? Chapter 1. The Quiet Village. The October morning draped St. Mary Mead in a delicate veil of mist, softening the edges of its thatched cottages and lending the high street an air of gentle secrecy. From her lace-curtained window, Miss Jane Marple surveyed the familiar scene, her knitting needles poised over a half-finished shawl of soft grey wool. The village, with its predictable rhythms, was a tapestry she knew by heart, each thread a neighbour, each knot a quiet drama. Yet today, her sharp blue eyes, untouched by the frailties of her advancing years, caught a subtle discord in the weave. At precisely 9:30, the butcher's van rattled into view, its engine coughing like an old man clearing his throat. Tom Greaves, the village butcher, was at the wheel, his broad shoulders hunched and his face set in its customary scowl. A man of few words and fewer graces, Tom was known for his punctual deliveries and a temper that could flare like a struck match. Miss Marple watched as the van halted outside Mrs. Bantry's cottage, its brakes squeaking faintly. Tom stepped out, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel, and retrieved a parcel wrapped in crisp brown paper from the back. He marched to the cottage door, deposited the package, and returned to his van with a haste that struck Miss Marple as peculiar. She tilted her head, her fingers pausing mid-stitch. "Now, what has upset Mr. Greaves so early in the day?" she murmured to herself. The morning unfolded with its usual cadence. The postman's bicycle wobbled past, Mrs. Price's spaniel yapped at a passing cart, and the church clock chimed 10. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind sifting through the village's undercurrents. Tom Greaves was not a man to hurry without cause. Had he quarrelled with a customer? Or was it something deeper, a shadow from his private life? She recalled a conversation at the Women's Institute, where Mrs. Bantry had mentioned Tom's recent irritability, even with his loyal assistant, Billy Harris. "He's been sharp as a cleaver lately," Mrs. Bantry had said, her eyebrows raised. Miss Marple's lips twitched. Dolly Bantry's flair for drama was endearing, but her gossip often held a kernel of truth. By noon, the village's calm shattered. Mrs. Bantry burst into Miss Marple's parlour, her hat askew, and her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Jane, it's simply ghastly. Tom Greaves is dead. Murdered. They found him in his van, just past the old mill bridge, with a cleaver in his chest. Can you imagine? In St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her expression serene, but her eyes alight with interest. "Murdered, you say? Dear me, how very shocking. Who found him?" "That young Billy Harris," Mrs. Bantry replied, sinking into a chair. "He went looking when Tom didn't return to the shop. Poor boy was white as a sheet, they say. Inspector Craddock's there now, poking about with his men. But Jane, who would do such a thing? Tom was no saint, but a cleaver. It's positively barbaric." Miss Marple's fingers traced the edge of her shawl, her mind already at work. "Barbaric, perhaps, but not without reason, Dolly. Murder is rarely random. A cleaver suggests intimacy, someone who knew Tom's tools, his habits. Tell me, did you receive your delivery this morning?" Mrs. Bantry nodded. "Yes, those chops I ordered. Tom left them on the step. I was out at the vicarage. But what's that got to do with it?" "Everything, my dear," Miss Marple said softly. "Or perhaps nothing. We shall see." Her thoughts lingered on Tom's hurried delivery, the parcel of chops, and the faint unease she'd sensed in his movements. In St. Mary Mead, secrets were like weeds, hidden in plain sight. waiting for a keen eye to unearth them. As Mrs. Bantry prattled on about the village's shock, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the high street, now bustling with curious onlookers. She thought of her old friend Miss Weatherby, whose nephew had once fallen foul of a seemingly simple man with a hidden grudge. People, she mused, are never quite what they seem. The mist was lifting, revealing the village's familiar contours. But for Miss Marple, a new puzzle had begun to take shape, one that promised to unravel the quiet threads of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 2. The Scene of the Crime. The October afternoon settled over St. Mary Mead, with a chill that crept through the hedgerows and lingered in the shadows of the old mill bridge. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her woolen shawl, walked with a measured step beside Inspector Craddock, whose youthful earnestness was tempered by a certain deference to her insight. The village was still reeling from the news of Tom Greaves's murder, and the high street buzzed with hushed voices and sidelong glances. Craddock had telephoned her cottage shortly after Mrs. Bantry's dramatic visit, his tone polite but urgent. "Miss Marple, I'd value your observations at the scene," he'd said, and she had agreed at once, her curiosity as sharp as her knitting needles. The old mill bridge, a narrow stone arch spanning the burbling stream, stood a half-mile from the village centre, where the road curved toward the meadows. The butcher's van was parked askew on the grassy verge, its white paint dulled by the mist that still clung to the air. A small crowd of villagers hovered at a distance, kept back by a constable whose face was set in a grim line. Miss Marple noted their expressions: curiosity, fear, and, in some, a flicker of satisfaction. Tom Greaves had not been a man to inspire universal affection. As they approached, Craddock gestured toward the van. "It's a nasty business, Miss Marple. Tom Greaves was found just after 11 this morning, slumped over the wheel. The cleaver was one of his own from the shop, we think. A single blow, straight to the heart. Whoever did this was precise and strong." Miss Marple's eyes, bright and bird-like, took in the scene. The van's front door hung open, revealing Tom's body, still seated, his head resting against the steering wheel. The cleaver's wooden handle protruded from his chest, the blade buried deep in his blood-stained apron. His face, frozen in a grimace, suggested surprise rather than struggle. The back door of the van was ajar, and a faint smell of raw meat mingled with the damp earth. Miss Marple stepped closer, her sensible shoes avoiding the muddy patches on the ground. She noted the absence of the parcel of chops Mrs. Bantry had mentioned, though a faint outline in the dust on the van's floor suggested where it might have rested. "No signs of a scuffle," Craddock continued, his notebook in hand. "No bruises, no torn clothing. The blow was clean, almost professional. We're waiting for the coroner's report, but it looks like he died instantly." Miss Marple tilted her head, her gaze lingering on a smudge of white powder on the van's rear door handle. "Curious," she said softly. "That looks like flour, Inspector. Tom was fastidious about his van, was he not? I recall Mrs. Bantry mentioning how he scrubbed it daily. Flour seems out of place." Craddock squinted at the handle, then jotted a note. "Flour, you say? Could be from his shop, I suppose. He handled sausage rolls, didn't he?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, her tone non-committal. She crouched slightly, her eyes tracing the ground near the van. A single set of footprints, deep and well-defined, led from the driver's door toward the stream, disappearing into the wet grass. The prints were large, suggesting a man's boots, but their clarity intrigued her. "These footprints, Inspector," she said, pointing. "They're unusually distinct, as if made deliberately. Have you followed them?" Craddock flushed, clearly caught off guard. Not yet, Miss Marple. The rain's been heavy, and we thought they'd be washed out. I'll have my men look into it." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her mind racing. Footprints in such soft earth could tell a story, but only if read before the weather erased them. She straightened, her gaze returning to the van's interior. A crumpled cigarette packet lay in the footwell, its brand unfamiliar to her. "Not a local brand," she murmured, filing the detail away. Tom Greaves was not known to smoke, but someone else might have. Craddock led her to the butcher's shop, a squat brick, building on the high street, its windows dark and its sign, "Greaves and Son, Quality Meats," swinging faintly in the breeze. The shop was locked, but Billy Harris, Tom's young assistant, was waiting outside, his hands stuffed in his pockets and his eyes darting nervously. He was a lanky lad of 19, with a shock of red hair and a face that seemed perpetually on the verge of apology. "Miss Marple, sir," he stammered, nodding to Craddock. I found him. I didn't know what to do." "Tell us again, Billy," Craddock said, his voice firm but kind. "Every detail." Billy swallowed hard. "I was in the shop all morning, cleaning the counters like Tom told me. He went out for deliveries at 9, same as always. When he didn't come back by 11, I got worried. I walked to the bridge and saw the van. He was just there, dead. I ran for the constable." Miss Marple watched Billy closely, noting the tremor in his hands and the way his eyes avoided hers. "You were alone in the shop all morning, Billy?" she asked gently. "No customers? No visitors?" No, miss," Billy said, his voice cracking. "Just me, scrubbing down. Tom didn't like interruptions." "And the cleaver?" Miss Marple pressed. "Was it kept in the shop or the van?" Billy hesitated, his fingers twisting the hem of his jacket. "In the shop, miss. Tom kept his tools on a rack by the counter. Sharp as anything, he always said." Craddock nodded, making another note. "We'll check the shop for missing tools. Thank you, Billy. Stay close in case we need you." As Billy shuffled away, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him. "He's frightened," she thought. "But not just of the murder. There's something he's not saying." She recalled a young gardener from her youth, a boy much like Billy, who had stammered his way through a lie to protect a friend. Fear, she knew, could bind a tongue as tightly as guilt. Inside the shop, the air was thick with the scent of sawdust and cold meat. The counter gleamed, evidence of Billy's cleaning, but the tool rack caught Miss Marple's eye. A row of knives and cleavers hung neatly, their blades polished to a mirror shine. One slot, however, was empty, its outline matching the size of the weapon in Tom's chest. "The murder weapon came from here," Craddock confirmed. "Someone knew exactly where to find it." Miss Marple's eyes swept the room, noting a sack of flour in the corner, its brand identical to that in Clara Dobbs' bakery next door. "Flour again," she mused aloud. "Mrs. Dobbs supplies the butchers, doesn't she? For their sausage rolls." Craddock nodded. "Yes, Clara delivers flour weekly. Billy usually collects it, though." Miss Marple's lips pursed. The flour on the van's handle, the missing cleaver, the footprints leading to the stream. Each was a thread in a tapestry she was only beginning to discern. She stepped outside, her gaze falling on the bakery's sign, its cheerful lettering a stark contrast to the grim events. Clara Dobbs was a robust woman with a quick laugh and a quicker temper, known for her crusty loaves and sharp opinions. Could she have been at the van that morning? Or was the flour a coincidence, a red herring in a village full of them? As they walked back to the bridge, Craddock shared more details. "We've questioned a few villagers. Mr. Pym, the grocer, admitted to a row with Tom over unpaid bills last week, and Miss Eliza Finch claimed Tom cheated her on a purchase, though she's always complaining about something. Then there's talk of a stranger seen near the mill a few days ago, a rough-looking man, tall, with a limp. Nobody knows him." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "A stranger, you say? That's worth pursuing, Inspector. Strangers in St. Mary Mead are rare, and rarely harmless." She thought of a case from years ago, when a mysterious visitor had stirred trouble in a neighbouring village, leaving behind a trail of deceit. Strangers, she knew, often brought secrets that disrupted the village's quiet rhythm. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the bridge. Miss Marple paused, her eyes tracing the stream's path as it wound through the meadows. The footprints, she suspected, were no accident. Someone had wanted them seen, perhaps to mislead. And the missing chops? Why take a parcel of meat from a dead man's van? She recalled a story her nephew Raymond had told her, of a theft designed to distract from a greater crime. The chops, she murmured, are not what they seem. Craddock glanced at her, his brow furrowed. You've got that look, Miss Marple. What are you thinking? She smiled faintly. Only that murder, Inspector, is like a badly knitted sweater. One loose stitch can unravel the whole thing. We must find that stitch. As they parted ways, Miss Marple's mind churned with possibilities. The flower, the footprints, the cigarette packet, the missing chops. Each was a clue, small but significant, like the details of village life she observed from her window. Tom Greaves had been a man of routine, yet his death suggested a hidden life, one of debts, enemies, or perhaps forbidden dealings. She thought of Clara Dobbs, whose bakery was so conveniently close, of Billy Harris, whose fear seemed to outweigh his grief, and of the stranger, a shadow on the edge of the village's story. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair. Her knitting resumed with a steady click. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow across the room, but her thoughts were far from cosy. St. Mary Mead, for all its sleepy charm, was a place where secrets festered, and she knew that Tom Greaves' murder was only the first thread to be pulled. The truth, she felt certain, lay not in the violence of the act, but in the quiet moments that had led to it, moments she would uncover, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 3. The Village Suspects. The evening air in St. Mary Mead carried a crisp bite, and the lights from cottage windows glowed like beacons against the gathering dusk. Miss Jane Marple sat in Mrs. Bantry's drawing room, her hands folded neatly over her knitting bag, her eyes flitting from face to face with the quiet alertness of a sparrow. Mrs. Bantry, ever the enthusiastic hostess, had gathered a small circle of villagers under the guise of tea and sympathy, though the true purpose was to dissect the day's grim events. The murder of Tom Greaves had set tongues wagging, and the room hummed with speculation, each voice weaving its own thread into the village's tapestry of rumour. Mrs. Bantry, her cheeks flushed from the fire, and her third scone, presided over the gathering with a blend of dismay and relish. "It's simply unthinkable," she declared, passing a plate of biscuits to Clara Dobbs, who sat stiffly in a high-backed chair. "Tom Greaves, of all people, struck down in his own van. I always said he was a rough sort, but murder, here, in our village." Clara Dobbs, the baker's wife, sliced her scone with a precision that bordered on menacing. Her broad face, usually cheerful, was set in a frown, her dark eyes darting toward the window as if expecting an intruder. "He was a brute," she said sharply, "always snapping at people, arguing with suppliers. Why, only last week I heard him shouting at Mr. Pym over some trifling debt. You'd think he owned the whole high street." Mr. Pym, the grocer, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his thin fingers clutching a teacup that rattled faintly against its saucer. A small, nervous man with a perpetually apologetic air, he was known for his meticulous ledgers and his tendency to blush under scrutiny. "That's nonsense, Clara," he said, his voice high. "Tom and I had words, yes, but it was settled. I paid him what I owed, every penny. No call to drag that up now." Miss Eliza Finch, a spinster of indeterminate age whose prim demeanour masked a talent for petty grievances, sniffed loudly from her corner. Her black dress, buttoned to the chin, gave her the appearance of a disapproving crow. "Tom Greaves was no gentleman," she declared. "He short-changed me on sausages last month, gave me £half less than I paid for. When I complained, he called it poppycock. Poppycock! I never trusted him after that." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene but her mind as sharp as the needles tucked in her bag. She noted Clara's forceful grip on her knife, Mr. Pym's flushed cheeks, and Miss Finch's vindictive tone. Each had a grievance, real or imagined, and each had been near the high street that morning. "How interesting," she said mildly, "that Tom inspired such strong feelings. One wonders who else he might have offended." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "Well, Jane, you're the one with the knack for these things. What do you make of it? Inspector Craddock's been asking questions, but he's got nothing solid yet. I heard Billy Harris was nearly in tears when he found the body. Poor lad, working for such a man." Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. "Billy is young," she said, "and youth is often burdened by loyalty or fear. I wonder which weighs heavier on him." She thought of the boy's trembling hands at the butcher's shop, his eyes avoiding hers as he spoke of the morning's events. Loyalty to Tom might explain his silence, but fear suggested something deeper, a secret, perhaps, that bound him to the crime. Clara set her plate down with a clink. "Billy's a good boy, but jumpy. Always was. Tom was hard on him, barking orders like a drill sergeant. If you ask me, whoever killed Tom did the village a favour." Her words hung in the air, and a brief silence followed, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Mr. Pym cleared his throat. "That's a bit harsh, Clara. Tom was difficult, but he didn't deserve that. Besides, what about this stranger everyone's talking about? Mrs. Price saw a man near the mill last week, tall and rough-looking. Not one of us." Miss Finch nodded vigorously. "Mrs. Price told me the same. Said he had a limp and a nasty scar on his cheek. Probably some vagrant up to no good. Tom likely crossed him, and that was that." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. The stranger was a convenient scapegoat, a figure onto whom the village could project its unease. Yet strangers in St. Mary Mead were rare, and their presence seldom went unnoticed. She recalled a long-ago incident in Chipping Cleghorn, where a stranger's arrival had masked a local's treachery. "A stranger," she said softly, "is only a stranger until we know his business. And Tom's business, I suspect, was more complicated than we realise." Mrs. Bantry clapped her hands, delighted by the hint of intrigue. "Oh, Jane, you do make it sound thrilling. But what could Tom have been mixed up in? He was just a butcher, after all." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where the last light of day outlined the village's rooftops. "Just a butcher," she echoed. "But even butchers have secrets, Dolly. A man doesn't die so violently without a reason. Perhaps it was money, or pride, or something altogether darker." She thought of the flower on the van's handle, a detail that nagged at her like an ill-fitting stitch. Clara's bakery supplied Tom's shop, and flour was a link between them. Could Clara have been at the van that morning, or was the flower a trace of someone else's presence? As the conversation turned to village gossip, Miss Marple listened with half an ear, her mind sorting through the morning's observations. The missing chops puzzled her most. Why would a murderer take a parcel of meat? It was an odd detail, like a dropped stitch in a pattern, and she sensed it held a key to the crime. She recalled a case her nephew, Raymond, had mentioned, where a stolen item had concealed a vital clue. A letter, perhaps, or a token of betrayal. The chops, she suspected, were more than they seemed. Clara's voice cut through her thoughts. "I saw Billy this afternoon, looking like a ghost. If he knows something, he's not talking. Tom probably bullied him into silence." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Clara, noting the edge in her tone. "Bullying," she said, "can make a person quiet, but it can also make them desperate. We mustn't judge Billy too quickly." She thought of Clara's own temper, so often masked by her jovial manner. Had Tom's arguments with suppliers included her? And Mr. Pym's debt, how deep had it run? As for Miss Finch, her grudge seemed petty, but pettiness could fester into something dangerous. Miss Marple had seen it before, in a village not unlike this one, where a small slight had led to a deadly reckoning. The gathering dispersed as the clock struck 8, the villagers departing with murmured sympathies and lingering glances. Miss Marple walked home under a sky pricked with stars, her shawl drawn tight against the chill. The high street was quiet now, the butcher's shop a dark silhouette against the moonlit cottages. She paused outside it, her eyes lingering on the bakery next door. Clara Dobbs had been quick to point fingers, but her unease was palpable, and Mr. Pym's defensiveness suggested more than a settled debt. Miss Finch, too, had a sharpness that belied her prim exterior. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but the picture remained elusive. At her cottage, Miss Marple lit a lamp and settled into her armchair, her knitting bag at her side. The fire cast flickering shadows on the walls, and she let her thoughts wander. Tom Greaves had been a man of routine, yet his death spoke of disruption, of secrets that had spilled over into violence. The stranger by the mill was a shadow in the narrative, but the true answer, she felt certain, lay closer to home. In St. Mary Mead, as in all villages, the heart of a crime was rarely far from the hearth. She picked up her needles, the soft click a counterpoint to her racing mind. A cleaver, she murmured, is a weapon of opportunity, but also of intimacy. Whoever struck Tom knew him well enough to hate or to fear. The flour, the footprints, the missing chops, the stranger's shadow, each was a clue, waiting to be woven into a pattern. As the fire burned low, Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet determination. The truth was there, hidden in the village's familiar rhythms, and she would find it, one careful thread at a time. Chapter 4. A Clue in the Flower. The morning sun broke through the October mist, casting a pale light over St. Mary Mead's High Street, where the daily bustle resumed with a cautious air. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat tilted against the breeze, made her way to Clara Dobbs's bakery, a loaf of bread her ostensible purpose. The village was still abuzz with talk of Tom Greaves's murder, but beneath the chatter lay a current of unease, as if the killer might still lurk among the familiar faces. Miss Marple's step was brisk, her mind sharper still, sifting through the threads of yesterday's discoveries, the flour on the van's handle, the missing chops, the footprints by the mill bridge. The bakery's bell jingled as she entered, and the warm scent of fresh bread enveloped her. Clara Dobbs stood behind the counter, her apron dusted with flour, her broad face forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Morning, Miss Marple," she said, wiping her hands on a cloth. "Terrible business about Tom, isn't it? I can't think who'd do such a thing." "Terrible indeed," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but her eyes keen. She selected a cottage loaf, her fingers brushing the counter as she studied Clara's movements. The baker's hands were steady, but there was a tightness in her jaw, a flicker of wariness that Miss Marple noted with interest. "You must have known Tom well, Mrs. Dobbs, supplying his shop as you did. Did you deliver flour to him recently?" Clara's smile faltered, and she busied herself rearranging a tray of rolls. "Oh, now and then," she said airily. "Billy usually picks it up, though. Saves me the trouble." Her eyes darted to a sack of flour in the corner, its brand the same as that in Tom's shop. Miss Marple nodded, her expression bland. "How convenient for you both. Flour does get everywhere, doesn't it? I imagine it's hard to keep a shop tidy." She paused, as if struck by a thought. "I suppose you didn't see Tom yesterday morning, before the tragedy?" Clara's cloth paused mid-wipe. "Me? No, I was here all morning baking, never left the shop." Her voice was firm, but her fingers tightened on the cloth, betraying a nervousness that Miss Marple tucked away in her mental ledger. As she paid for her loaf, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the sack of flour, its coarse weave identical to the one she'd seen in the butcher's shop. The smudge on the van's handle nagged at her, a small detail that refused to fit neatly into the village's routine. Flour was common enough in a bakery, but in a butcher's van, driven by a man who prided himself on cleanliness, it was a discord, like a dropped stitch in a familiar pattern. She thanked Clara and stepped outside, her mind turning over the baker's unease. Mrs. Dobbs is hiding something, she thought, but is it guilt or merely fear? Back at her cottage, Miss Marple set the loaf on her kitchen table and settled into her armchair, her knitting bag at her side. The morning's visit had confirmed her suspicion. The flour was no accident. Someone had been at the van after handling flour, and Clara's bakery was the most likely source. But had Clara herself been there, or was another hand at work? She thought of Billy Harris, the nervous assistant who had access to both shops. His fear at the butcher's shop had been palpable, but was it born of witnessing the crime or of knowing more than he dared say? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Mrs. Bantry swept in, her scarf trailing and her eyes bright with news. "Jane, you'll never guess what I've heard. Mrs. Price was at the post office, and she swears she saw Tom arguing with a stranger near the mill last Thursday. A tall man, rough-looking, with a limp and a scar on his face. She said Tom looked furious, waving his arms like a windmill. What do you make of that?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Very interesting, Dolly. A stranger in St. Mary Mead is always worth noting. Did Mrs. Price hear what they were arguing about?" Mrs. Bantry shook her head. "Not a word, but she said it was heated. She didn't like the look of the man. Said he had a shifty air. Do you think he's the killer?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone measured. "But strangers are convenient culprits, and convenience can obscure the truth." She thought of a long-ago summer in Much Benham, where a stranger had been blamed for a theft that a local had committed. The stranger by the mill was a piece of the puzzle, but she suspected the heart of the matter lay closer to home. Mrs. Bantry perched on the sofa, her curiosity undimmed. "You're being cryptic, Jane. What are you thinking? Something about that flower, I'll bet. You had that look when you mentioned it yesterday." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Flower is a small thing, Dolly, but small things can unravel great mysteries. I'm wondering about Tom's business dealings. He was not a man to make enemies lightly, yet enemies he had. The flower suggests a connection to the bakery, and Clara's manner today was guarded." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "You don't think Clara had anything to do with it? She's a bit sharp-tongued, but murder? With a cleaver?" "Not necessarily," Miss Marple said, her needles pausing. "But she knows more than she's saying. And then there's Billy, who seems frightened out of his wits. Fear can make a person silent, or it can make them reckless. We must watch him closely." As Mrs. Bantry chattered on, Miss Marple's mind returned to the van, the flour, the missing chops, the footprints leading to the stream. Each was a clue, but none yet formed a clear pattern. The stranger intrigued her most. A man with a limp and a scar was memorable, yet no one else had reported seeing him. Was he a figment of village gossip, or a real figure in Tom's hidden life? She recalled a case her friend Sir Henry Clithering had once described, where a stranger's presence had masked a local's betrayal. The mill, with its quiet stream and secluded path, was a perfect place for a secret meeting, or a deadly one. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a walk to the village post office, where gossip flowed as freely as the stamps. Miss Weatherby, the postmistress, was sorting letters behind the counter, her spectacles perched on her nose. "Dreadful about Tom Greaves," she said, as Miss Marple approached. "I saw him yesterday morning, you know, driving past at 9 sharp. He looked out of sorts, even for him." "Did you notice anything unusual?" Miss Marple asked, selecting a few envelopes for her nephew Raymond. "Anyone with him, perhaps?" Miss Weatherby shook her head. "Not a soul. Just Tom, scowling as usual. Though I did see Billy Harris later, running from the shop like the devil was after him. pale as milk he was. Miss Marple thanked her and stepped outside, her mind turning over Billy's behaviour. The boy was a thread that kept reappearing, his fear a constant note in the village's uneasy melody. Was he protecting someone, or hiding his own involvement? She thought of a young maid she'd known in her youth, whose silence had shielded a lover's crime. Billy's nervousness suggested a similar burden, but whose? As she passed the butcher's shop, its windows still dark, Miss Marple paused. The bakery's sign swung gently next door, and she pictured Clara's flour-dusted hands, her strained smile. The flower on the van's handle was a link, but to what? A delivery gone wrong, a confrontation at the bridge, or something more sinister? And the chops, why take them unless they concealed something vital? She recalled a story from her days in London, where a stolen package had hidden a blackmailer's note. The idea lingered, teasing the edges of her thoughts. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit the fire and settled into her chair. Her knitting resumed with a steady rhythm. The village was a puzzle, its pieces scattered but slowly coming into focus. Clara's unease, Billy's fear, the stranger's shadow, the missing chops. Each was a clue, waiting to be stitched together. Murder, she mused, is a human act, born of human passions. Tom Greaves crossed someone, and that someone struck back. As the firelight danced, her eyes gleamed with quiet resolve. The truth was near, hidden in the village's quiet corners, and she would find it, one careful thread at a time. Chapter 5. The Stranger's Shadow. The late morning sun cast long, dappled shadows across St. Mary Mead, where the village seemed to hold its breath, caught between the shock of Tom Greaves's murder and the relentless march of daily routine. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped loosely over her shoulders, walked with purpose toward the old mill bridge, her sensible shoes tapping softly on the cobbled path. The air was sharp, with the scent of damp leaves, and the stream gurgled beneath the ancient stone arch, its surface rippling with secrets. Her visit to Clara Dobbs' bakery had left her with more questions than answers, and the persistent image of the flour-dusted van handle gnawed at her like an unfinished row of knitting. Today, she sought to unravel another thread, the mysterious stranger who had stirred the village's imagination. Inspector Craddock had telephoned her cottage earlier, his voice tinged with the frustration of a man chasing shadows. "We've found something, Miss Marple," he'd said. Letters, tucked in Tom's shop ledger, anonymous, typed, and rather unpleasant. "I'd value your thoughts." The invitation was all she needed, and now, as she approached the bridge, she felt the familiar prickle of anticipation, like a gardener sensing a hidden root beneath the soil. Craddock met her near the butcher's van, which still stood forlornly on the grassy verge, cordoned off by a constable who looked bored but vigilant. The inspector's face was drawn, his notebook clutched tightly as he gestured toward a small evidence bag on a folding table. Inside were 3 typed letters, their edges crisp and unyellowed as if freshly printed. "Found these in the shop this morning," he said, tucked behind the ledger's cover, almost like Tom meant to hide them. Their demands: pay what's owed, or face consequences. No signature, no handwriting. Whoever wrote them was careful. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and peered at the letters through the plastic. The type was clean, the words blunt. "You know what you owe. Pay by Friday, or the village knows your shame." The others were similar, each more insistent than the last. "Typed, not handwritten," she murmured. "That suggests someone educated, or at least cautious. A typewriter is not so common in St. Mary Mead these days. Is it, Inspector?" Craddock shook his head. "Not common at all. We're checking the village for one, but it's likely an old machine, maybe from the vicarage or the post office. Miss Weatherby says she hasn't used hers in years, but we'll look into it." Miss Marple's lips pursed. A typewriter implied deliberation, a desire to conceal identity. She thought of a case from her youth, where anonymous letters had unravelled a web of jealousy in a quiet parish. Blackmail, she said softly, is a dangerous game. It makes enemies of both the victim and the writer. Tom must have known his tormentor, or suspected them. Craddock nodded, his brow furrowed. That's what I'm thinking. But who? Mr. Pym's debt comes to mind, but he swears it was settled. And Clara Dobbs, well, she's been cagey, hasn't she? Then there's this stranger Mrs. Price mentioned. We've had no luck tracking him down. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the stream, where the water flowed swift and clear over smooth stones. The stranger is intriguing, she said, but we must be wary of distractions. Let us see what the mill tells us. She stepped carefully toward the bank, her eyes scanning the ground where the footprints had been. The rain had softened the earth, blurring the tracks, but she spotted something new, a cigarette stub, half buried in the grass, its paper marked with a foreign brand she didn't recognize. She pointed it out to Craddock, who retrieved it with a gloved hand. Not Tom's brand, he said, examining it. He didn't smoke, according to Billy. This could be our stranger's, or someone who wished us to think so, Miss Marple replied, her tone mild but her mind sharp. The cigarette stub was a deliberate clue, like the footprints, and she wondered if both were meant to mislead. She recalled a story her friend Sir Henry Clithering had shared, of a crime where planted evidence had obscured the true culprit. We must find this stranger, she said, but we must also look closer to home. As they walked back toward the village, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Billy Harris. The boy's fear had been evident at the shop, his answers clipped and evasive. She decided to seek him out, hoping to coax a fragment of truth from his nervous silence. She found him outside the butcher's shop, sweeping the pavement with unnecessary vigour, his red hair falling into his eyes. His face paled as she approached, and he gripped the broom tightly. "Good morning, Billy," she said kindly, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. "You've had a dreadful shock, haven't you? I wonder if Tom ever mentioned a stranger, a man with a limp, perhaps?" Billy's eyes flicked to the ground, then back to her, wide and wary. "No, miss. Tom didn't talk much, not about strangers or anything. He just told me to keep the shop clean and do my work." His voice trembled, and he resumed sweeping, though the pavement was spotless. Miss Marple watched him closely, noting the way his hands shook. "You were fond of Tom, weren't you?" she asked gently. "It must be hard, losing him so suddenly." Billy swallowed hard, his knuckles white on the broom handle. "He was all right, miss. Tough but fair. I don't know anything about what happened. Honest." He turned away, his shoulders hunched, and Miss Marple let him go, her mind cataloguing his fear. He's protecting someone, she thought, or hiding his own part in this. But what? Back at her cottage, she settled by the fire, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. The letters, the cigarette stub, the flower, all pointed to a crime rooted in secrets. But whose? The stranger was a shadow, a figure that loomed large in the village's gossip, but remained elusive. She thought of Clara Dobbs, whose bakery linked her to the flower, and Mr. Pym, whose debt might have driven him to desperation. Even Miss Finch, with her petty grudge, could not be dismissed. But Billy's fear was the most telling clue, a thread that tugged at the heart of the mystery. That afternoon, Mrs. Bantry arrived, her face alight with fresh gossip. "Jane, you'll never believe it. Miss Weatherby says she saw Billy running from the shop yesterday, just after Tom's last delivery. He looked terrified, she said, like he'd seen a ghost. And there's more. Mr. Pym was seen near the mill bridge that morning, before the body was found. What do you make of that?" Miss Marple's needles paused. "Mr. Pym at the bridge? That's curious, Dolly. He didn't mention being there yesterday, and Billy's behaviour grows more intriguing by the hour." She thought of a young man she'd known in St. Mary Mead years ago, whose fear had masked a loyalty to a guilty friend. Was Billy shielding Clara, or perhaps Mr. Pym? Or was his fear born of something else entirely? As Mrs. Bantry chattered on, Miss Marple's mind turned to the letters. Their typed precision suggested a mind that planned carefully, yet their demands hinted at desperation. Blackmail was a motive for murder, but so was fear of exposure. Tom Greaves, with his brusque manner and hidden dealings, had likely crossed someone who saw no other way out. The stranger, the flower, the chops, all were pieces of a puzzle, but the picture was still incomplete. She rose and walked to her window, gazing out at the high street, where life continued in its quiet way. The butcher's shop stood dark, a silent witness to the crime. Tom Greaves was not a simple man, she murmured. His death was no accident, but a reckoning. The question is, whose? The fire crackled behind her, and her eyes gleamed with quiet determination. The truth was close, hidden in the village's daily rhythms, and she would find it, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 6. The Missing Chops. The October light in St. Mary Mead had softened to a golden haze, bathing the village in a deceptive calm that belied the undercurrent of suspicion rippling through its lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat at her small writing desk, her knitting pushed aside for the moment as she jotted notes in her neat, spidery hand. The puzzle of Tom Greaves's murder was beginning to take shape, but one detail nagged at her with persistent clarity: the missing parcel of chops. Why would a murderer, having struck a man down with his own cleaver, take a package of meat from the scene? It was a question that demanded an answer, and Miss Marple's mind, as sharp as the pins in her sewing basket, was determined to find it. The morning had brought no new revelations from Inspector Craddock, who was occupied with tracing the typewriter used for the anonymous letters. Miss Marple, however, felt the key to the mystery lay not in the mechanics of the crime, but in its human threads, the motives and fears that wove through the village's quiet life. She recalled a conversation with her nephew Raymond, who had once described a theft that concealed a far greater secret. The chops, she suspected, were no mere whim of the killer, but a deliberate act meant to obscure something vital. She decided to visit Mrs. Bantry, whose cottage had been the last stop on Tom's delivery route. As she walked along the high street, her eyes took in the familiar sights. The post office, where Miss Weatherby sorted letters with a gossip's ear. The grocer's, where Mr. Pym's nervous figure darted behind the counter. And the bakery, where Clara Dobbs's sign swung in the breeze. Each held a piece of the puzzle, but the chops were the thread she needed to pull. Mrs. Bantry welcomed her with a flurry of excitement, her drawing room already cluttered with teacups and a half-eaten plate of scones. "Jane, I was just about to send for you," she exclaimed, her scarf slipping from her shoulders. "The village is positively buzzing. They're saying Tom was mixed up in something shady, smuggling perhaps, or worse. And those chops of mine, gone, vanished. I told Craddock they were left on my step, but when I came back from the vicarage, there wasn't a trace." Miss Marple settled into a chintz-covered chair, her expression serene, but her mind alert. "How curious, Dolly," she said. "You're certain Tom delivered them? You didn't see them yourself?" Mrs. Bantry shook her head. "I was out from 9 to 10, at the vicarage for the flower committee. Tom must have left them on the step, as he always does when I'm not in. But they were gone by the time I returned, and then, well, you know what happened next." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Indeed, a parcel of chops doesn't simply vanish unless someone took it. And why take chops unless they were more than they seemed?" She thought of a case from years ago in a seaside town, where a stolen item had concealed a message that led to the killer. "Tell me, Dolly, was there anything unusual about Tom's deliveries recently? Anything out of the ordinary?" Mrs. Bantry frowned, her brow creasing. "Now that you mention it, he was a bit odd last week. He delivered a roast, but it was wrapped in 2 layers of paper, which isn't like him. I thought he'd just been careless. But perhaps, oh Jane, Do you think he was hiding something in his deliveries? Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. It's possible, Dolly. Tom was a man of routine, but routines can mask secrets. The chops may have been taken to hide something, a note perhaps, or evidence of his dealings. She paused, her mind turning to the anonymous letters Craddock had found. Could one have been pinned to the parcel? A final demand that the killer sought to conceal. Leaving Mrs. Bantry's cottage, Miss Marple walked toward the mill bridge, her thoughts circling the crime's peculiarities. The flower on the van's handle pointed to Clara Dobbs' bakery, but the missing chop suggested a deeper motive. She pictured the scene. Tom, struck down in his van, the cleaver a weapon of chilling intimacy. The killer had acted swiftly, taking the parcel before fleeing. But why not leave it? The answer, she felt certain, lay in what the chops concealed. At the bridge, she paused, her gaze tracing the stream's path. The footprints she'd seen were long gone, washed away by rain, but the cigarette stub Craddock had collected lingered in her mind. Its foreign brand suggested an outsider, yet the village's gossip about a scarred, limping stranger felt too convenient, like a tale spun to divert suspicion. She recalled a story her friend Sir Henry Clithering had told, of a crime where planted clues led the police astray. Was the cigarette such a clue, or a genuine trace of the stranger? Her reverie was broken by the sight of Billy Harris, hurrying along the path from the village, his head bowed and his hands stuffed in his pockets. His red hair gleamed in the sunlight, and his face, when he looked up, was pale and drawn. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Billy, a word if you please. You seem troubled. Is there something you'd like to tell me about Tom?" Billy froze, his eyes wide with a fear that seemed to pulse beneath his skin. Nothing, miss," he stammered. "I told the inspector everything. I was in the shop cleaning when it happened. I didn't see nothing." Miss Marple tilted her head, her gaze soft but piercing. "You're a good lad, Billy, but fear can make even the honest tongue falter. Did Tom ever mention anything about his deliveries? Perhaps something hidden in them?" Billy's hands twitched, and he looked away, his voice barely a whisper. "He didn't tell me nothing, miss. Just said to keep the shop running and not ask questions. I don't want trouble." He turned and fled toward the high street, his footsteps quick and uneven. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind cataloguing his reaction. He knows something, she thought, but whether it's guilt or loyalty, I cannot yet say. She recalled a young shop assistant from her youth, whose silence had shielded a master's misdeeds until the truth could no longer be contained. Billy's fear was a thread, and she would follow it. That evening, Inspector Craddock called at her cottage, his face weary, but his eyes bright with a new lead. "We've confirmed the cleaver was Tom's, taken from the shop's rack," he said, settling into a chair. "No fingerprints, though, wiped clean, and the typewriter search is a dead end so far. Miss Weatherby's machine is broken, and the vicarage hasn't used theirs in months. But we did find something else, a receipt in Tom's shop, dated last week, for a delivery of meat from an unfamiliar supplier. Not local, and the name's a bit odd. J. Carver, Imports. We're looking into it." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind racing. "J. Carver," she murmured. "An unusual name, and Imports suggest dealings beyond St. Mary Mead. Perhaps this ties to the stranger Mrs. Price saw." She thought of the cigarette stub, the foreign brand a hint of something larger. A smuggling operation, perhaps, or a debt that crossed village lines. "And the chops, Inspector," she added. "Have you considered they might have held something? A letter, or evidence of Tom's dealings?" Craddock's brow furrowed. "A letter, like the ones we found? It's possible, I suppose. But why take the whole parcel?" "To ensure nothing was left behind," Miss Marple said simply. "A parcel is easier to carry than a single sheet of paper, and less likely to be noticed missing." She paused, her eyes gleaming. "We must look to those closest to Tom. Clara, whose flower marks the van, Billy, who fears to speak, Mr. Pym, whose debt may not be as settled as he claims, and the stranger, who may be less a stranger than we think. Craddock nodded, his respect for her insight clear. You've a way of seeing things, Miss Marple. I'll have my men dig into this Carver fellow and keep an eye on Billy. If he's hiding something, we'll find it. As Craddock left, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her fingers moving with a steady rhythm. The missing chops were the key, she felt certain, a small act that hid a larger truth. Tom Greaves had been a man of secrets, and one of those secrets had led to his death. The flower, the letters, the cigarette, the stranger, all were threads in a tapestry she was beginning to discern. She thought of Clara's guarded manner, Billy's trembling hands, Mr. Pym's nervous denials. Each was a piece, but the chops were the stitch that could unravel it all. The fire crackled, casting shadows across her parlour. Murder, she murmured, is never just about the act. It's about what comes before. The greed, the fear, the betrayal. The truth was near, hidden in the village's quiet corners, and she would find it, one careful thread at a time. Chapter 7. The Truth Unravels. The late afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's parlour, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor. The village of St. Mary Mead, though outwardly serene, thrummed with the tension of an unsolved murder, and Miss Marple's mind was a hive of quiet activity, piecing together the threads of Tom Greaves's death, the missing chops, the flower on the van's handle, the anonymous letters, the cigarette stub. All were clues, but it was the human motives behind them that held the key. She had decided to gather the village's principal suspects for tea, a setting where tongues might loosen and truths might slip. With Inspector Craddock's blessing, she had invited Clara Dobbs, Billy Harris, Mr. Pym, and Miss Eliza Finch to her cottage, ostensibly to share sympathies, but in truth to weave the final threads of the mystery. The parlour was cosy, the fire crackling softly, and the tea tray laden with a Victoria sponge and delicate china cups. Mrs. Bantry, unable to resist the prospect of drama, had insisted on joining, her eyes bright with anticipation as she arranged the cushions. Miss Marple, seated in her favourite armchair, her knitting bag at her side, greeted each guest with her usual gentle courtesy, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Clara Dobbs arrived first, her robust figure filling the doorway, her smile strained as she clutched a basket of freshly baked rolls as a hostess gift. Mr. Pym followed, his thin frame hunched and his hands fidgeting with his scarf. Miss Finch, prim and severe in her black dress, entered with a sniff, her lips pursed as if the very air offended her. Billy Harris was last, his red hair dishevelled, his eyes darting nervously as he mumbled a greeting and took a seat near the door. Mrs. Bantry poured the tea, her chatter filling the room with a false ease. "Such a dreadful thing, Tom's death," she said, passing a cup to Clara. "The village hasn't been the same. Jane, you've been so calm about it all. Have you any theories?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her hands folded over her lap. "Theories, Dolly, are like half-knit scarves. Best kept private until the pattern is clear. But I do think it's time we spoke plainly about Tom Greaves. He was a man who stirred strong feelings, wasn't he?" Her eyes moved slowly from Clara to Mr. Pym, then to Miss Finch, and finally to Billy, who shrank into his chair. Clara set her cup down with a clink, her face flushed. "He was difficult," she said, her voice sharp. "Always arguing, always demanding. Suppliers like me had to put up with him, but it wasn't easy." Mr. Pym cleared his throat, his fingers twisting his scarf into knots. "He was fair in business mostly. We had our disagreements, but nothing serious. I paid my debts, as I told the inspector." Miss Finch sniffed, her eyes narrowing. "Fair? He was rude, Mr. Pym. Cheated me on sausages and laughed when I complained. A man like that makes enemies. Miss Marple's gaze settled on Billy, who was staring at his untouched tea. And you, Billy, she said gently. You worked for Tom every day. What did you think of him? Billy's hands trembled, and he looked up, his face pale. He was, all right, miss, tough, but he taught me the trade. I didn't have no quarrel with him. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her mind razor-sharp. Let us consider the morning of the murder, she said, her voice soft but commanding attention. Tom made his deliveries, including a parcel of chops to Mrs. Bantry's cottage. Yet those chops vanished, and a cleaver from his shop ended his life. Curious, isn't it, that a killer would take meat from a dead man's van? She paused, her eyes on Clara. Mrs. Dobbs, you supply flour to Tom's shop. I couldn't help but notice a smudge of flour on the van's handle that morning. Can you explain it? Clara's hands tightened in her lap, her knuckles whitening. Flour? I delivered some to the shop the day before, like I told you. It must have lingered. I was baking all morning, never left my shop. Miss Marple's lips twitched. Flour lingers indeed, but on a van scrubbed daily by a man as fastidious as Tom. It's an odd place for it, don't you think? She turned to Billy, her tone still gentle. And you, Billy, were in the shop, cleaning, you said. Yet you saw nothing. No one coming or going, no stranger near the bridge. Billy's eyes darted to the floor, his voice barely audible. No, miss, I was just cleaning. Didn't see nothing. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes gleaming. The chops, I believe, are the key. They were taken not for their value, but for what they hid. A letter, perhaps, like the ones Inspector Craddock found in Tom's ledger. Demands for payment, typed with care to conceal the writer's hand. Her gaze shifted to Mr. Pym, whose face had gone ashen. Mr. Pym, you're a meticulous man, with a typewriter in your office, I believe. Those letters spoke of debts unpaid, of secrets to be exposed. You owed Tom money, didn't you? And when he refused to wait, you wrote those letters, threatening to reveal his dealings with a certain J. Carver, an importer of questionable goods. Mr. Pym's teacup rattled violently, and he set it down, his hands shaking. I didn't kill him, he stammered. Yes, I wrote the letters. I was desperate. He was bleeding me dry, buying smuggled meat to undercut my prices. I only wanted my money back, not his life. A hush fell over the room, broken only by Mrs. Bantry's gasp. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, cutting through the tension. Desperation can drive a man to extremes, Mr. Pym, but I don't believe you struck the blow. Your letters were a threat, not a weapon. Her eyes turned to Clara, whose face was now rigid with fear. Mrs. Dobbs, you knew of Tom's smuggling, didn't you? Your bakery supplied his shop, and a scandal would have ruined you both. That morning, you saw Tom at the van, perhaps delivering those chops. You found a letter pinned to the parcel, a final demand that exposed the smuggling operation. In a moment of panic, you took the cleaver from his shop and struck him, then took the chops to hide the letter. Clara's breath caught, her hands gripping her skirt. No, she whispered, but her voice broke. I couldn't. Miss Marple's gaze was unrelenting, though her tone remained soft. The flower on the van's handle betrayed you, Clara. You were there, in a hurry, perhaps after an argument with Tom. You knew where the cleaver was kept, and you acted swiftly, thinking to protect your livelihood. But murder leaves traces, and the truth always finds its way. Clara's face crumpled, and she buried it in her hands. He'd have ruined us, she sobbed. He said the smuggling was my fault, that I'd pushed him to it with my prices. I saw the letter on the parcel. It named me, said I'd go to prison. I didn't mean to. It was so quick. Inspector Craddock, who had been standing quietly by the door, stepped forward, his face grave. Clara Dobbs, I'm arresting you for the murder of Tom Greaves. He led her out, her sobs echoing in the quiet parlour. Mrs. Bantry stared wide-eyed as the door closed. Jane, how did you know? The flower, the letter, it all fits. But how? Miss Marple picked up her knitting, her needles clicking softly. People, Dolly, are like patterns in a shawl. They seem simple, but their motives are complex. Clara's fear, Mr. Pym's desperation, Billy's silence, all were threads. The chops were the loose stitch, hiding a truth too dangerous to leave behind. As the room emptied, Miss Marple gazed out the window, the village settling into its evening calm. The truth had been unravelled, but the cost was heavy. A woman's life undone by a moment's panic. She sighed softly, her needles moving with quiet precision. St. Mary Mead would heal, but its secrets would linger, waiting for her keen eye to uncover them once more. Chapter 8. The village settles. The October dusk settled gently over St. Mary Mead, painting the sky in hues of lavender and gold, as if the village sought to soothe itself after the storm of Tom Greaves's murder. Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlour window, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, crafting a scarf for her nephew Raymond in soft blue wool. The high street below was quiet, its cottages glowing with lamplight, but the air held a lingering weight, as if the village were exhaling after holding its breath too long. Clara Dobbs' confession had closed the case, yet Miss Marple's mind, ever attuned to the human heart, lingered on the threads that had unravelled to reveal the truth. Inspector Craddock had called earlier that day, his voice a blend of relief and admiration. "You've done it again, Miss Marple," he'd said, standing in her doorway with his hat in hand. "Clara's been charged and she's not denying it. Broke down completely, said she acted in a moment of fear. We found the missing chops too, hidden in a bin behind her bakery, with a typed letter pinned to the parcel. It named her as complicit in Tom's smuggling, just as you thought." Miss Marple had nodded, her expression serene but her eyes thoughtful. "Fear, Inspector, is a powerful spur. Clara saw her life's work crumbling and struck out to save it. A pity, but not a surprise. She had declined to visit the station, preferring the quiet of her cottage to the bustle of formalities. The truth, she knew, was not in the paperwork, but in the human frailties that had led to the crime. As she knitted, her thoughts drifted to the village's other players. Billy Harris, freed from the shadow of suspicion, had taken over the butcher's shop, his nervous demeanour giving way to a quiet determination. She had seen him that morning, polishing the shop's counter with a newfound confidence, as if the weight of Tom's dominance had lifted. "He'll do well," she mused, recalling a young man from her past who had found his footing after a master's fall. Loyalty had bound Billy to silence, but with Clara's confession he was free to speak, though he had little to add beyond his relief. Mr. Pym, however, had not fared so well. His role as the blackmailer, though not the murderer, had tarnished his reputation. The grocer's shop was quieter now, and whispers in the post office suggested he was planning to sell and leave St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy. His desperation had driven him to folly, but not to violence. She thought of a shopkeeper she'd known in her youth, whose pride had led to a similar fall. "Pride," she murmured, "is a fragile thing, easily bruised." Miss Eliza Finch, predictably, had taken the news with a sniff and a sermon on Tom's character, her grudge over the sausages undimmed. At the Women's Institute, she had declared the village well rid of that rude man. But Miss Marple noted her absence from the high street, as if even she felt the weight of the village's scrutiny. Pettiness, Miss Marple reflected, could be as isolating as guilt. Mrs. Bantry had visited at noon, bursting with questions and a plate of homemade biscuits. "Jane, you're a marvel," she'd exclaimed, settling into the armchair with a rustle of skirts. "How did you know it was Clara? The flower, the chops. It's like something out of a novel. And that stranger, what was he about? Was he real? Or just a red herring? Miss Marple had smiled, offering a biscuit in return. The stranger, Dolly, was real enough, I think. J. Carver, the importer, likely sent an agent to deal with Tom, a man with a limp and a scar perhaps, to collect payments or deliver threats. The cigarette stub was his, I suspect, but he was not the killer. Clara's fear of exposure drove her hand, not an outsider's grudge. She had not mentioned the stranger's fleeting role to Craddock, sensing he was a loose thread that led beyond the village, to a world of smuggling that no longer concerned St. Mary Mead. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze drifting to the high street. The butcher's shop was lit again, its sign gleaming under Billy's care. The bakery, however, stood dark, its future uncertain without Clara's bustling presence. The village would heal, as it always did, its rhythms resuming like the steady click of her needles. Yet Miss Marple knew that secrets like weeds would always take root, waiting for her keen eye to unearth them. She rose, setting her knitting aside, and lit a lamp, its glow casting a warm circle in the parlour. People, she murmured, are so predictable, yet so surprising. Tom Greaves's death was a moment, but his life wove the threads that led to it. She thought of Clara, whose fear had turned to violence, of Billy, whose silence had protected her, of Mr. Pym, whose desperation had set the stage. The chops, the flour, the letters, all were stitches in a pattern she had unravelled, but the human cost lingered. Outside, the village settled into night, its cottages quiet under the stars. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the scarf growing steadily under her hands. St. Mary Mead was peaceful once more, its secrets tucked safely away, until the next mystery stirred its calm. She smiled softly, her eyes bright with the quiet resolve that had solved so many puzzles before. The truth, she knew, was always there, hidden in the village's daily weave, waiting for her to find it, one careful thread at a time.